Welcome to the Preserving Family Podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to equip you to gain insight, information, and inspiration to help you protect, teach, and guide your family during these turbulent times. Our goal is to provide tools and resources to help you strengthen and preserve your own marriages and families. Now here are your hosts, Dr. Mark and Janie Ogletree.
Everyone, thank you for being here. I wanted to share this special, what I would call this special message on our prophets as fathers, what kind of fathers they were. And to lead into that, I shared some data as we started last time, and I'll share some more data now. But even though there's arguments in the world we live in today that fathers are really not necessary, we just don't need dads, research doesn't really bear that out. In fact, research tells us that those who have children who have fathers that are involved in their lives have stronger emotional well-being. They have higher sociability, confidence, and self-control. They report lower rates of anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems. Daughters with involved fathers show about 22 to 25% lower rates of depression and anxiety disorders. Just think of what dads can do to help calm their families down a little bit. Hopefully, a healthy father. And then teenagers with engaged fathers report lower rates of substance abuse and delinquency. In fact, more data here, because father involvement also impacts behavior and social development. Children with involved fathers are less likely to engage in risky behaviors in their teenage years. Boys with engaged fathers are 20% less likely to develop what we would call a conduct disorder. And positive father relationships increase empathy, problem-solving ability, and stress tolerance. There's even benefits physically. Father involvement is correlated with health, for sure. Children with involved fathers have 30% higher likelihood of meeting physical activity guidelines. Sons with involved fathers have 30% lower obesity rates. And father involvement in early childhood may reduce ADHD risk by about 18%. Infants, this is interesting. Infants with responsive fathers show higher mental development scores, and early father interaction improves language development and school readiness. Now, we are grateful that we live in a world where people are understanding how vital fathers are to the development of their children. Today, fathers spend about 7.3 hours a week in direct child-related activities. And 63% of new fathers report being very involved in baby care. Father participation in child care has increased about 20% over the last decade. And so this is all really cool stuff. In fact, I feel that because of the research and the messaging about fathers and about the need for fathers, over the course of the last 20 years, I think father participation and involvement has improved so much, and that's good news. We love sharing good news with everyone, and that's good news. Now, what I did is I decided to categorize our living prophets using a model by David Dollahite, Alan Hawkins, and Sean Brotherson. They were building off of Erik Erikson's developmental theory, and in their theory, they came up with 8 fatherhood strengths. Commit, choose, create, and consecrate were the first 4, and that's what we talked about in our episode part 1. And today in episode part 2, we're going to talk about the importance of care, change, connect, and communicate. Yes, they all start with a C. So we will call this strength number 5, the responsibility and capability to care involves the call and capacity to do for children what they need done at different stages in their development in varying situations. So strong fathers provide for their children what they need at that time, at the time that they need it. Care is definitely signified by father presence and active involvement. So now we're talking really about father involvement, like we were just sharing some of that data. I love this statement as we talk about Joseph Fielding Smith for a minute. It was his wife, Ethel, who paid this tribute to him after 24 years of marriage. This man that I know is a kind, loving husband and father whose greatest ambition in life is to make his family happy. He is the man that lulls to sleep a fretful child, who tells bedtime stories to the little ones, who is never too tired or too busy to sit up late at night or to get up early in the morning to help the older children solve perplexing school problems. When illness comes, the man I know watches tenderly over the afflicted one and waits upon him. It is their father for whom they cry, feeling his presence as a panacea for all ills. Now, this is kind of fun for me because I remember early in our parenting years that sometimes the nursery leaders would say that our children would cry for me rather than Janie. And I love that Janie always thought, hey, that's great. I'm with these guys all the time. If they're crying for you, you go get them. She was just fine with that. But I love that Joseph Fielding Smith was such a tender, tender father. I think that this idea of care has a lot of tentacles, right? It just reaches out a little bit everywhere. One of the places where it reaches, I think, is not just caring for our own families and our own children, but also being kind and caring and in tune to the needs of other children around us. I love as I watch members of my ward and stake reach out and take under their wings, so to speak, other youth, other children who need extra care and love and support. It's a great story here about President Sister McKay. Besides rearing and educating their own children, David and Emma Ray McKay invited many students to live in their home, and these they assisted in their efforts to secure an education. These young people, now with families of their own, still sing the praises of this ideal home where they were permitted to share and live with the McKays. There's a lot of evidence of other prophets who have demonstrated and practiced that kind of care and outreach to others, not just their own children, but to others who needed help and support. This is kind of a different way to care, but I just love the story and I thought I would share it with you. This is back to Joseph Fielding Smith. And here's what one of their children said. The atmosphere at home naturally influenced the boys toward competitive sports at school. Douglas, in mentioning this, tells in his own words the incident referred to once when he was injured in a football game. He said this: in an effort to make a tackle of a running back, I caught his heel under my chin and I was knocked out. I lay on the sidelines until the game was over, and then in the locker room I was again instructed to lie down on some blankets. Dad came down to be with me. This is Joseph Fielding Smith, as it happens in locker rooms. The language got to be a little rough. My father stood up on a bench and called everyone to attention and delivered a sermon on swearing that was very effective, but embarrassing to me. So I acted like I passed out again. Can you imagine that? Your dad is just chewing out all of your best friends on the football team and for swearing, and you're just like, okay, I'm out, and you just kind of shut down like that. Here's another one about a father's care and concern. In 1933, Spencer and Camilla Kimball learned that their youngest son, Eddie, had contracted polio, and soon after, they found themselves in a Los Angeles hospital trying to provide Eddie with the best care possible. Eddie was 3 years old at the time, and he had been quarantined. He was totally isolated from his parents and screaming at the top of his lungs for them. He was literally terrified. And for 3 days, Spencer and Camilla paced the grounds outside of the hospital in despair, barred from their baby, listening to his scream and cry. Eddie would cry, "I want to go home, Daddy," and "Mama," until his voice became raspy and hoarse. After a few intense days in the hospital, Spencer wrote to the 3 oldest children back home in Arizona. Here's his letter, or here's a quote from it. "Send a letter from you all every day, as it will help Mother a lot." Or in other words, every one of you send a letter every day to Mom. Don't fail. She can hardly stand it to be away from her baby. And it isn't so easy for Dad either. President Kimball talking about himself. How about another way to care for our children is to show them how we care for other people and to take them along. Here's another example from George Albert Smith's life. One of his children said, "Father always took us with him to make the rounds of forgotten friends that he visited on Christmas. I was a very little girl, and I remember going down a long alley in the middle of a city block where there were some very poor houses. We opened the door of one of the tiny homes, and there on the bed lay an old woman, very sad and alone. And as we came in, tears ran down her cheeks, and she reached over to take hold of Father's hand. as we gave her our little remembrances. And then the woman said, I am grateful to you for coming, because if you hadn't come, I would have had no Christmas at all. No one else has remembered me. But who did remember? George Albert Smith. And who did he take? One of his children with him, so that they could be part of that ministering and understand how crucial it is. Those who care get involved. Not only are they involved with their own children, but they're also involved, as I said earlier, with children in the neighborhood, in the community, in the ward. Here's another kind of fun story about involvement, and it's about President Howard W. Hunter. I love that he used to tell his sons bedtime stories about growing up in Boise and travels to the Orient. His experiences seem like tales from the Arabian Nights, except that these stories were better because they actually happened. Now, this is kind of fun because if you know the story, President Hunter's dad did kind of the same thing. He would gather the children around, and he would tell stories about traveling the whole world, although he had never traveled the world, so he was kind of making these stories up, but he would also read these stories from books. And so he'd say, hey, let's go to Japan tonight. And he'd pull out a book about Japan, and they'd learn all about Japan. Well, this is just telling me that President Hunter continued that, but in his case, he had actually been to some of these places. I love this. He was known to take his sons to the airport to watch planes take off and land. Every so often, Howard would take his sons to the railroad station to get ideas for their own train set at home. Eventually, he had a swimming pool built in their backyard so his sons could have fun parties and invite a lot of people over. And then he would teach his sons piano lessons. But eventually, he said, the effort to get them to practice was more than I could cope with, and music lessons finally came to an end about 2 years after they started. Don't you love that? Here's a father saying, oh yeah, they quit piano. It just wasn't worth it. And we have children that quit piano lessons too, and it makes me feel a little bit better, right? Hearing that President Hunter had to do the same thing. Here's another one now, and the strength, the fatherhood trait. We call it change, but change means to adapt and to become flexible, which I think is such an important attribute. In fact, I learned that as a bishop years ago, when I started to notice that if we had leaders in our youth programs that weren't adaptable or flexible, they usually didn't work out real well. You've got to be able to roll with the flow when you're with teenagers, right? And so back to the research from Dollarhite, Hawkins, and Brotherson, making a statement that successful fathers are able to change and adapt the care given as children grow and as the father matures as well. And they know how to respond to their children as things shift, as things change. And so I love that President Harold B. Lee, and I've already talked about him just a little bit, but I'm going to talk about him a little bit more. One of the ways that he made changes or adaptations in his life is recognizing that with teenagers, you got to do things a certain way, right? And you got to be able to roll with the flow a little bit. So the Lee home became a favorite place for young people. Here the Lee girls and their friends were sure to find a welcome mat, to dance out on the patio for refreshments, and even visiting with Elder Lee, who was an apostle at the time, who always made himself available to talk and to counsel and to motivate young people. Frequently, when the girls hosted gatherings at their home, their father would spend many hours beforehand manicuring the yard, painting and fixing up the house, arranging the lights and furniture. He would even sometimes pitch in during the party to barbecue the meat, flip hamburgers, and make himself useful so the young people could enjoy themselves. Now, how would that have been to have been a youth growing up in Salt Lake back in the 1940s and 50s, and Apostle Lee just lives around the corner, and you're over at his house just talking to him and watching him flip hamburgers and play the piano and have fun with the youth? A lot of you are familiar, and I know that there's been some questions about this account. It's a different story, but it's John Taylor. And talk about a father adapting and changing his whole plans. But this is when John Taylor's son cries and cries and cries during the exodus from Nauvoo to the west. And part of the reason is because he's left his rocking horse behind. And John Taylor, who was actually wanted by the mobs, risks his life and goes back after they've crossed the Mississippi River, goes all the way back and grabs that rocking horse and brings it to bring it to eventually all the way to Salt Lake, because his son wanted it and he just couldn't be consoled without it. I think that's pretty cool. All right, strength number 7 is connection. And I love this idea. Connection is relationship. If we could just say it that way, that's really all that we're talking about, is to have a relationship with our children, which in truth is probably should be the number one. I mean, I know we have commitment as the number one trait, but maybe right behind commitment is connection or relationship. To connect with a child is to form healthy, lasting attachments with that child. And a father can't connect with their children unless they're involved in their lives, and successful fathers establish bonds with their children. The father-child relationships are strengthened when fathers are competent and they know how to respond to their children's needs. But we've got to connect with them, and the way we connect with them, once again, is by spending time with them. I love this story from the life of Howard W. Hunter. Back to President Hunter again. Now, he had only 2 sons, John and Richard, and they became active in scouting, and their parents tried to help them with their merit badges. And to qualify for the badge in camping, John had to sleep in the open, out at night, open sleeping bag or open tent on the ground for 50 nights. He had slept out on some scout trips and father and son outings, but he needed many more nights to complete the 50. And so that year, President Hunter and his sons camped out often. A favorite camping area was the Los Angeles Arboretum, just down the block from their home in Arcadia. It had a lake surrounded by dense jungle-like foliage that had provided a set for some Tarzan movies back in the day. Now, on one unforgettable night, they drove all the way to the Mojave Desert, arriving after dark. They were soon fast asleep in their sleeping bags, and in the middle of the night, President Hunter wrote this, that a blast of a streamliner woke us with a startle as the headlights from a train was shining directly on us. Now, imagine this. They're out in the desert, and what they didn't know is they had set up their sleeping bags right next to a railroad, right next to railroad tracks. And now they wake up in the middle of the night, seeing the bright light and hearing the whistle from the train. We were terrified as the train rushed down upon us. And in their minds, from where they were positioned, the train was coming right at them. And I'm sure they were like, are we in a bad dream? What's going on here? But just as it looked like the train was going to mow them over, this train swerved to the left and screeched by us. They had made their camp right near a curve from the Santa Fe Railroad. And in his history, Howard made this conclusion: although we had many enjoyable nights together, I'm glad when the 50 were completed. So true. So many things have been said in the past years about Brigham Young. A lot of those things from those who are not real great supporters of the church. In fact, even from some members of the church. And one of my thoughts is that one of the great things a person could do is really study Brigham Young's life and view him in the whole package, so to speak. And one of the ways that I think we can really have a fondness for Brigham Young is to learn what kind of father he was. Because like Elder Oaks and others who are judged a certain way, I think if we understood who Brigham Young really was and the type of man he was, we would understand him a lot better and be a lot more kindly in the way that we view him. Susie Young Gates, one of Brigham Young's daughters, recalled that her father disciplined the children when they needed it, but he never gave them the humiliation of correcting or punishing them before other children or before the family or even strangers. He would take them aside, then or later, and in his kindly fatherly way told them that he felt that they had what they had coming in the way of correction or discipline. And his practice was this, that no child should ever be punished while the parent is angry. This is a great lesson from Brigham Young on how he connected with his own families. In the evenings, after dinner, a family home evening was held, which included discussions of family problems, singing, and a program of the children reciting poetry, playing instruments, and performing skits. At the end of the program, everyone knelt while Brigham Young offered the evening prayer. After the younger children were put to bed, the wives and the older children made popcorn or molasses candy for a bedtime treat. Brigham often enjoyed a bowl of fresh popcorn with sugar and cream. Now, I've never tried that, everyone. Maybe you have, but it sounds pretty good. His door was always open for his children to communicate their concerns and problems. And some of his children later related that they would rather go to him with their problems than their mothers because of his great tenderness. Brigham was also the one who had all kinds of exercise devices installed in a home gym so that his children could have those experiences of exercising and becoming physically fit. Here's another mode of connection here, told by Francis Gibbons in his book about Joseph Fielding Smith. He said, as one might expect, Elder Joseph Fielding Smith was anxious to share his convictions with his children. And probably the most important thing he did, said his daughter Amelia, was to never miss an opportunity to bear his testimony to the family when we were all together, to let us know what a great debt of gratitude we all owed to the Savior for what he did for us and how much he, Joseph Fielding Smith, loved Jesus Christ. What a great dad, just constantly finding ways to bear testimony to his children. The last strength that we'll talk about today is communication. And we know how crucial communication is and how difficult it can be in a world where we're constantly going 90 miles an hour. But you can't be a strong father without being a strong and successful communicator. And to communicate effectively is to relate with children by sharing meaning with them, both verbally and non-verbally. Effective fathering, said Dalla Hawkins and Brotherson, means working to maintain an ongoing, evolving, improving, meaningful dialogue with one's children throughout their lives. It means fathers teach and are taught, tell and hear stories, give and receive counsel, and regularly communicate their love for their children and their pride in them. It means enjoying positive and helpful communication when administering discipline or discussing painful subjects. And so this idea of communication is not just, what we would call positive, uplifting, building communication. We know that's important. But also we need to discipline, right? We need to work on that as well and help correct our children when their behavior's not appropriate. I love the connection that must have existed between George Albert Smith and his son, who also, his name was George as well. They were joined in a bond of love and admiration, wrote Francis Gibbons. They were frequent hiking or camping companions, and sometimes the apostle took young George with him on church assignments. After Elder Smith became the president of the church, when he was confronted with complicated problems affecting the growth of an international organization, he was heard to say often, "I need my boy," as he thought about George's special skills in corporate organization management. And if I remember right, President Smith's son, George, was a Harvard graduate and had skills in that business management area. And here was a prophet saying, "I need my son. I really need my son." Connection, by the way, isn't always physical. Sometimes it's spiritual. And I hope you'll appreciate this story. David O. McKay may have saved the life of his son, Lawrence, just by being sensitive to the Spirit. Now, Lawrence one day was hauling a load of beet pulp from West Ogden over the viaduct when Father, who was having a rare moment's leisure at home just reading, suddenly closed his book and stood up. And Emma Ray said to David, "Where are you going?" And she saw him hurrying down the hall. He yelled back to save Lawrence's life. Over his shoulder, he yells that. Gets in his car, and drives as fast as he can to the top of the viaduct in Ogden, just as his son Lawrence was about to start the descent down from that viaduct. Imagine kind of an overpass. He said, "Just as I was about to start the descent, my dad reminded me that I was driving a team of horses abreast." In parentheses, I did not need a reminder of that. That they were pulling 4 tons of beet pulp and that the wagon had no brakes. While I held the reins, he got out of the car to block a wheel by chaining a spoke to the body of the wagon. Unfortunately, we were holding up traffic and the car behind us honked. That spooked the horses, by the way. I moved the team to get out of the way, but we had started the descent. The team could not stop, and by the time we reached the bottom, the horses were racing out of control. And on the left side of the road, we hit a car that emerged from behind the candy factory, smashing the motor but sparing the driver. One of the horses slipped and fell down. I seized the momentary check to leap down and sit on the horse's head, keeping it from getting up. And we were saved. If Father had not stopped us, and if that car had not come out of that at that moment, we would have careened onto busy Washington Avenue, Ogden's Main Street, probably knocked over a few pedestrians. My feelings of gratitude for my father cannot be overestimated. Now, once again, what's the principle? The principle is President McKay was sitting at home reading where he had a thought, my boy's in trouble. And he gets up and he gets going and he ends up saving his life and maybe the lives of a few others. Here's more on spiritual connections as well from President Hinckley's life. The Hinckleys communicated principles like this to their children: being responsible, working hard, doing what you say you're going to do, getting an education, being disciplined, finishing what you start, keeping the commandments, and so forth. Dick, one of President Hinckley's sons, we call him Richard, but Dick recalled a crucial period in his own life. He said, when I was going through some years of questioning and having some doubts as a teenager, my dad was like an anchor. I don't recall discussing many of the concerns with him, but in my heart, I knew that he knew that the gospel was true. And that was terribly important to me. I knew that he was a believer, not because he talked overtly or often about his feelings, but I just sensed that he knew. God was real and personal to him. Joseph Smith's experiences were real to him. And there was no question in my mind that he had any doubt of their authenticity or the truthfulness of the gospel. Now, there's another connection, there's another spiritual connection of son to father on this one, where a son having some doubts and some issues with the gospel gets by just knowing that his father knew. And he had so much faith in his dad. I'm gonna expand this idea of connection as we talk about the Hinkleys for just a minute more and sharing how President Hinckley would do that also with humor. Gordon used stories to convey his admiration for people and character traits. This is from Sherry Dew's book, Go Forward with Faith. As the family sat around the dinner table or worked in the yard, he told stories about Ira Hinckley building Cove Ford, about his own boyhood or mission, about a neighbor or friend he admired, about pioneers who exhibited faith and fortitude. Now, everyone catch that. As he sat around the dinner table or worked in the yard, President Hinckley was sharing these stories, these experiences, something all of us as parents can do when we put down the phone and connect with our families this way. And then back to humor now. Gordon loved to hear or tell a good story and would laugh so hard as he approached the punchline that he could hardly speak or breathe. Watching him react was almost more fun than the joke itself. Family gatherings became laugh fest, and at times the hilarity got out of hand. What a great, great way to connect with our family. Now, here's another way to connect with your family, your children. Because maybe one crucial way we disconnect with them is when we're angry or mad or we're disciplining out of anger. And so I love that President Hinckley had so much control that if there needed to be some kind of, if there was going to be anger expressed or whatever, he would just disconnect himself from that. Let me read you the story back from Sherry Dew. There was normal jockeying between parents and children, and there were plenty of times when Gordon's children stretched his patience, though he wasn't inclined to explode or lose his temper. When the inevitable challenges of child rearing arose, traffic tickets, minor accidents, lateness coming home, and the like, Gordon had his own way of coping. He got out his hedge clippers and went outside and pruned the trees. The exercise was good therapy. And I don't know if you want to call that hedge clipper therapy or what. But I love that President Hinckley, instead of yelling or screaming or getting upset and losing his cool, he would go out and trim the hedges and then come back in when he got control of himself. Now perhaps we come to probably one of my favorite stories, because today we see a lot of parents telling their children multiple times, right? Go get your shoes on, or go pick that up, or go clean your room, or go do this. And I'll watch parents do that sometimes, even at the church. I can watch sometimes parents give a command that is repeated 5, 6, 7, 8 times. President McKay had a rule. He had a belief, and that was you never, ever repeat a clear command. And if you repeat it, then the child will wait for the repetition. Isn't that a great principle? And an example of this principle, we were riding to Huntsville in the Surrey. Oh, I wish we could all imagine this. Father was driving, and mother beside him on the front seat, and Llewellyn and I, this is told by Lawrence McKay, were sitting in the rear seat. I was not very old, and I was scuffling with Llewellyn. This was dangerous, of course, because one of us could fall in front of the wheel, could fall out of the surrey and fall under the wheel. Father quietly told me to stop. I love that. President McKay was in complete control. He just simply quietly said, stop. I persisted. Then Father let me out of the carriage, or in other words, Father kicked me out of the carriage, right? I can still remember walking up the hill and seeing the team in the surrey going along, getting further and further away by the minute. I was old enough to have walked the rest of the way and was certainly in no danger on the country roads in those times. But Father let me walk far enough just to contemplate the lesson in sufficient leisure, and then stopped and waited for me. I was a much chastened boy when I climbed back into the surrey. There was no more teasing or quarreling after that. I love it. Never repeat a clear command, and then let the consequences follow. And the consequence was, you're not going to ride with us if you can't behave yourself. And so he was out. I love this one from the Bensons. Back to Sherry Dew, Ezra Taft Benson's biography. When a child had seriously misbehaved, the disappointment showed on Ezra's face as he walked away crestfallen. That was often punishment enough, said Mark, one of the sons. I knew how important it was to my parents for me to do what was right, and none of us wanted to let them down. So just that expression on their face. And then one that is probably a family kind of, maybe I don't want to say joke, but funny point, certainly in our family, because I remember telling my own children about this story, and they all laughed when I told them, that when Joseph Fielding Smith's children, he would simply say, well, it says he would put his hands on our shoulders and say in a very hurt tone, I wish my kiddies would be good. And then it says that was the most effective punishment he could give us and was far worse than any spanking could have ever been. That simply the thought that we had hurt him. Now, I got to tell you that when I told my own children that, I said, now, guys, this is how it worked in the home of Joseph Fielding Smith. He just said, I wish my kiddies would be good, and they all straightened out. They just all laughed and thought that was hysterical. Anyway, I wish I had that kind of influence. And then on the idea that if we're going to connect and communicate with our children, I guess we're on number 8, communication, that we certainly have to control our tongue and speak with the tongue of angels. And this is a great, great story. Once again, I've learned a lot from it. And this is told by, once again, Lawrence McKay. He said, I can recall only one occasion where my dad even sounded impatient, and he certainly had provocation. He was playing baseball with Llewellyn and me in the backyard of our Ogden house. I was the pitcher and Llewellyn was batting, and Father was catching and coaching simultaneously. So imagine one son is pitching, one son is batting, and President McKay's the catcher. And of course, he's coaching from back there. We were just youngsters, and when Llewellyn smacked the ball, he was so excited that he flung the bat behind him, hitting Father right in the head. So everyone, all you dads out there, you just got hit in the head with a baseball bat from your kid. And then David O. McKay said this, don't ever throw a bat, Father exclaimed. If you can't play baseball better than that, and that was it. He stopped. He caught himself. He went into the house to tend his goose egg, and Llewellyn and I contemplated wide-eyed the close call we had inflicted on our dad. But I love it. President McKay was probably going to say something he was going to regret later, and so he controls his tongue, which was something he had taught on many occasions. On many occasions. Now, some of you may be familiar with the phrase that President Ezra Taft Benson made famous. He said, praise your children more than you correct them. I love this great statement from the Benson family. It says, never did he, our dad, Ezra Taft Benson, leave for or return from work without kissing his wife and hugging the children. They both believed that it was hard for disharmony to brew if they ever let a child leave home without a hug. And constantly the Benson children were told, we're proud of you. What a good job you did on that. We have confidence in you. Words like that. So even in an era where that probably wasn't vogue or popular to praise or to build up our children, the Benson family was doing it. I love it. What a great example there. I just think there's so many wonderful examples. And by the way, we've just scratched the surface. We were definitely on top of the water here today. We weren't digging deep. We were just right on top of the water, just sharing some experiences for those to match up with those principles. But there are literally hundreds of them, right? I wrote a book on David O. McKay a few years ago as a father called No Other Success was the title of the book, and showed how President McKay exhibited every one of those 8 traits that we've been talking about, from commitment to communication, from care to connection. And I didn't even exhaust all of those stories, and that was just on one prophet, David O. McKay. Just think now, what we could say about each of those presidents of the church. Now, in doing so, they serve as an example to every one of us on how to be better parents, on how to love, how to connect, how to have fun, and those kinds of things. Now, in quoting Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6, and a lot of you are familiar with that verse, reminding us that the hearts of the fathers would turn to the children, and the hearts of the children would turn to their fathers. President Harold B. Lee said this about that verse. Keep in mind this, he said, that when the full measure of Elijah's mission is understood, that the hearts of the children will be turned to the fathers and the fathers to the children, it applies just as much on this side of the veil as it does on the other. If we neglect our families here and having family home evening, and we fail in our responsibilities here, how could we feel that we are doing our full duty in turning the hearts of our children to their fathers? So the hearts of you fathers and mothers must be turned to your children right now, if you have the true spirit of Elijah, and not think that it applies merely to those who are on the other side of the veil doing family history work. Well, I think that's just a great reminder that we want our hearts to be drawn out and turned to our children now. I'm grateful for these prophets and for the stories and experiences that we've shared today, and for their connections with their families. I stand by what I've said over and over again, that these were really, really great and awesome, incredible men, long before the church as a whole even knew who they were. And once again, they serve as examples to all of us. We can look to their examples and try to become more like them in terms of how they treated their wives, how they treated their children, and then, of course, how they lead the church, in our case, with President Dallin H. Oaks today. Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you'll be willing and feel prompted to share it with someone who could benefit by it. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week, and I look forward to being with you next time. Until then, have a great week, everyone.